Afternoon, everybody. Thank you for your time again this afternoon. Appreciate you giving time up from your busy schedules to be here. This is obviously the second part of the training exercise, and as you'll be aware, today we're taking an application through the process. And obviously, I'm aware that a number of members here will be quite familiar with how we do this at North East, but I think hopefully take quite a lot of value from the exercise being an application from a different place. And we're obviously not in the heat, so to speak, of a public meeting now. So I think hopefully be able to concentrate on the key stages of the process and have a discussion around those as we go through. Obviously, members met Garreth from PAS last time, and Councillor Stevens, Bill Stevens, was on Teams, so joined the last meeting remotely, but good to see him here in person. And just to introduce Nina, who is a colleague of Gareth's, who's attending to support today. So I'll hand over to Garreth for the start. Thank you.
So is that working okay, Alan? Yep. Fantastic. Yeah, really good to see you. Thank you for coming back. It is good to be back. Was it the 10th of June that I was last down here with my colleague Rachel when we did the decision-making training? It feels like a long time ago, doesn't it? It feels like we're in a very different world. And obviously we've had a general election, we've had a lot of announcements, and I think it's really kind of interesting just to see how many announcements that the new government have made have been quite relevant to us as planners and members of planning committee. So I think although we had to move this training to allow the general election, I think it's really good that we've got this chance to come back and, as David said, do another session in light of everything that's happening in the country, because I think it just shows how, just how kind of relevant planning is. You've heard who the team are. Hopefully you know who I am as well. I just thought, before we get into our planning role play, this is going to be a case study, a role play, for us to try and put into practice the skills that we talked about at the last training session. Before we do that, just really quickly, would it be helpful just to think about actually what's just been said? So obviously, we've had a new government. I just wanted to kind of we haven't got time today to talk about all the interesting things that's happening at a general, kind of general level of planning and nationally in planning at the moment. But I just thought it was really, really interesting just to reflect on what Rachel Reeves said last week about planning and what some other of government announcements have said about planning. So obviously you've probably been watching the news as much as we have, so first of all, well, Angela Rayner has changed the name of her ministry now. We've got a slightly different name. We've gone back to the Ministry of Housing, Communities and Local Government. We've heard as well that the new government are going to consult on a new national planning policy framework. Before the end of this month, we should see what that's got to say. But we have heard from the announcements that the new government is looking to what they call restore mandatory housing targets. So the emphasis on those housing need calculations will become much, much heavier in planning policy. Straight away when the government came in as well, they've already removed some kind of footnotes in the NPPF that made it very difficult for onshore wind to be developed in our part of the world. So that de facto ban, as the government called it, has been removed because that policy has been removed from the NPPF. We've also got a commitment from the government to see local authorities ensure universal local plan coverage, and as part of that, reviews of Greenbelt as well. So we've just been talking over lunch just how interesting that could be and what that could mean for your part of the world. We know that the new government as well also want to prioritise energy projects and see big infrastructure like transmission lines, like power stations, move a lot quicker in the system, and I know that's relevant to your part of the world as well. We've heard that there's going to be a new special task force to help deliver sites that are stalled, so we might see some extra support from central government with expertise and staff who can help us do that. And we've heard as well that the government are going to quickly appoint 300 new planners in local authorities. And we've got about 315 different local planning authorities in our country. So that's slightly less than one each. And we don't know what that means in practice for North East Derbyshire, or indeed where these planners might come from, because, oh, thank you. Cheers. Because planners are quite a special breed, aren't they? We don't have enough of them. So we want to see more planners, but you can't invent planners. And, you know, there are all kinds of initiatives to try and encourage more people to move back into planning. And, of course, what the government have said as well is that they're going to take a policy of more direct intervention. So the Deputy Prime Minister, Angela Rayner, has said that she's going to be a lot more hands-on reviewing planning applications that have a potential for big regional or national impacts. And she, of course, has the power to call in planning applications if she feels they're significant enough for the government to be involved in decision-making. So yeah, we'll not get into detail, but I just think it's really interesting how important planning is in the current climate, and how much of a high profile that we've got politically and in the media as well. We've seen a lot more media coverage nationally in the newspapers and on the TV as well. So everything we're doing here today, I think, I guess it just reminds me just how important it is as well. And of course, we've got the King's Speech tomorrow as well, and we are expecting some new bills around planning and energy security in that as well. So something for us to look forward to tomorrow. Are you excited? Yeah. So, can you remember where we conclude? Having that as context, and we're all looking forward to the King's Speech tomorrow. Having that as context, let's just remind ourselves where we concluded back in June when we did our defensible decision-making training. Remember, I'm sure that you've committed it all to memory. We talked about the importance of starting with the local development plan when it comes to making decisions in planning committee. We talked about the starting point of our decision is that presumption in favour of sustainable development, something that often needs explaining to our constituents, because that's our starting point for looking at a planning application. We'd use the term material quite a lot, if you remember, defining what was material when we're making decisions and what isn't material, and therefore what is relevant to you when you make your decision. And we also talked a lot as well about the really important role that planning officers play, and encourage people, members on committee, to seek advice from officers when they're not just actually in committee, but before committees, if they've got questions or want to clarify issues or have concerns about an application, seeking advice from officers as well. And of course, really, this is all about carefully considering the evidence that might be needed should you make a decision that goes against officer recommendations for approval, making sure that you've got the evidence and the rationale to defend a decision that you've made at appeal should you refuse it. So we talked about all of those things so that we can assure that you reach a decision that a reasonable decision maker, properly directed would have reached. That's a kind of semi-legal term, and that's what we're trying to ensure, that your decisions are seen as reasonable and have been properly directed, and it would be a decision that other planning committees in other parts of the country would have come to as well, so that we can assure where you do refuse a planning application against officer recommendations, you have sound planning reasons to enable you to do that, and these reasons are kind of reasonable in planning law. And also, we talked a bit about as well, you know, encouraging people to visit the results of decisions. I'm just talking earlier over lunch just how important and what an impact local planning committees and you as members have on your community, that you can literally walk around your area and point to things that have happened because you've made a decision in planning committee, and sometimes as well that haven't happened because you've made a decision in planning committee. So, you know, that chance to reflect as well. So, these are the objectives for this session. What we want to do now is really work through a case study style, an exercise where you as planning committee members will work through a planning application in a way that enables you to make a defendable planning decision. And all right, we're going to do that we've got plenty of time. I think we've got up to 3 hours if we need it. So we've got plenty of time to work through this as you normally would in committee. But we also want to reserve a little bit of time at the end as well, so that we can reflect on what lessons we've learned and what you think you've learned from this session. Because it's a real case study. I won't say where it's from, but it's from a very different part of the world, where you've kind of received a report that's had all the names changed, and any references to people or places have been removed that could identify it is. But it was a real report that went before a real planning committee somewhere in a different part of the country, and a decision was made on that. So we'll be able to kind of make our decision from here today, but also go back to see what happened in that actual case study exercise and learn from what happened there as well, and reflect on any differences that there might be. And this is how it will work. So the aim is, we really want to make sure that this session is run as similar as it can be to one of your planning committee meetings. So there'll be a presentation of the application as it would be from an officer. So Nina here is going to be our case officer today and present to you the case as Adrian would from any other committee meeting. We are going to have some speakers as well. I'm really grateful to some of your colleagues who have offered to speak as an applicant and as a ward member, as an objector. So there will be a little bit of acting and a little bit of role playing there, so we can hear what the different perspectives are in this case study. And then of course you can ask us questions as you would your officers. So myself and Nina and other officers in the room would be able to answer questions that you might want to raise before you go into discussion about this application and then come to a decision. Once you've reached your decision, we'll have a little break, because I think we'll be ready for it by then. But then after the break, we'll come back and we'll reveal what actually happened in real life on this decision, and we'll be able to maybe reflect on what happened then and what decision we've come to today, look at the differences, look at the similarities, and in particular what we want to do is talk a lot about whether your decision was a sound one and whether you feel you would do anything different in light of what you've learned as well. Because this isn't a test of, how good you can role play or act. This is very much a test of how we work in a planning committee and work in line with the best guidance to come to the best decision. So we hope we'll have some lessons to learn as well. Okay. Right, so has anyone got any questions before we move into our case study role play? Everyone's got their report. I can see some people have highlighted it and already read it. That's a good sign, isn't it? I'm sure you have. We've got the report, we've got the normal agenda, and now what's going to happen, I'm going to hand over to Nina, who's going to be our case officer, and will present it as a planning officer would. Okay, so and I will hand over to Councillor Williams, Stevens, who will be our chair.
Thanks, Gareth. So yeah, good to see everybody. It is good afternoon. Nina, if you can take us through the application before us at this stage, that would be much appreciated. Thanks.
Hi everyone. Today we are Ford Council, and this application is for the land west of Axel Hill Drive in Capri Ford. This is an outline application for the development of up to 700 dwellings and all necessary supporting infrastructure, including land for provision of a convenience store or community facility, internal access roads, footpaths, cycleways and parking, open space, play areas and landscaping, drainage, utilities, and service and infrastructure works. So all of these matters are reserved except for access and site boundaries, as this is an outline application. This application is being presented to committee because it is a large-scale development, and it represents in part a departure from the development plan, and it has generated a significant amount of local interest. Okay, so this is on page 28 of your report. Feel free to rip it out because it's a big page, but this is the site parameters plan and the illustrative master plan of the application site. So as you'll see, the red boundaries are the boundaries of the site. It is bordered to the west of a important countryside gap. To the south, there are some road works that are going to be put in on the site that are a part of the application. And then there's going to be low-density residential housing, medium and high-density residential housing, self-contained open space within the development. The blue arrows are vehicular access, and then the yellow arrows are pedestrian and cycleway access. So going into more detail, if you go on page 4 as well, the description of the development, the application site occupies the land immediately to the west of Axel Hill Drive and predominantly to the north of Sprocket Road. It extends slightly to the south of Sprocket Road without any housing on that bit of the development as well. On its northern end, it extends up to the southern boundary of Fiesta Academy, and adjoins to rear gardens on the western end of Jack Chase. Up there, there's also the Jack Farmhouse, which is a grade 2 listed building that borders the application site, is not a part of the application site. The existing land use is agricultural, and the site is characterized by open arable farmland. Members will also note that several pedestrian and cycle-only links are proposed to connect the site with the adjoining urban area and local road network. And there's the important countryside gap. There will be a new roundabout as part of the development, and works to widen Sprocket Road to accommodate the congestion that is proposed on this development. So this is pages 28 and 29. Hopefully you've ripped these out already. So this part of the site for the application is allocated in the local plan, but not entirely. So if you compare these two, you'll see that there's some parts of land on the local plan allocation site that are not in the application, and there's parts that are in the application that are not in the local plan allocation. So this is a more cohesive image of these two. So to the west of the application site, you'll see that there is 2 bits of open land. These are not allocated, but these for the application would be for drainage purposes, so there would be no housing on here. And then you'll see that I'm gonna point to it. Here to the left, that will be for housing, and that is the only bit of unallocated land that will be for housing. The rest accounts for a loss of grade 3 agricultural land, and it lies within the important countryside gap. Going on to the allocated land that is not in the application, which are the white boxes to the north and to the east of the map. To the north, it is an old orchard of environmental value that will not be a part of the application. And then to the right will be open land. Both of these, as they are allocated, could still be developed on later. So that explains the vehicular access arrows to accommodate for that in case that is something that would happen in the future. So to talk about the local plan specifically and the site allocation, it requires a minimum of 620 dwellings on this site. We expect the developer to agree a master plan with us, as well as provide a landscape framework before getting planning permission. We require the developer to create substantial woodland buffer bordering the development, especially to the south on Sprocket Road. There will be self-contained open space that will serve the needs of the development. Retention of the natural features, for example, the overgrown orchard that is in the allocation, as well as conserving the setting of the listed Jack Farmhouse building that is also in the allocation. To develop a high-quality design and agreed-upon design code for the site, provide a mix of housing in accordance with the local plan policy DM1. Notably, this policy requires a mix of 2 and 3 bed housing and does not mention any need for affordable housing in the local plan. As well as providing footpath and cycle path links to the surrounding area and deliver a scheme of transport improvements to address capacity issues, for example, on Sprocket Road and with the roundabout. So this is to summarize the allocation versus the application. Most of the site is within the site allocated for strategic housing in our adopted local plan. Part of the red line bordering the application site is outside of the allocation in open countryside and is grade 3 agricultural land. 2.1 hectares of this land would contain housing. The application does not include approximately 2 hectares that is in the site allocation. The delivery and funding of highways improvements is important for the application to be viable. At the time of writing the report, Ford Council had a 4.3-year housing land supply, but results of a housing delivery test is likely to reduce it to 3.6 years, which is below the 4 years that the NPPF requires. And then constraints of the site. The development would be of open farmland formerly within the countryside gap, which is quoted in the Ford Council local plan, that it serves a purpose to separate different settlements in the council. Development on agricultural land. So as mentioned, this is grade 3 agricultural land, which is good or moderate agricultural land, and according to mapping by Natural England and DEFRA, has a low likelihood of containing the best, most versatile agricultural land. And the location of the Jack Farmhouse, which is not on the site application but is next to it, is a grade 2 listed building. So keeping the character of the building itself, but more importantly in this context, the setting and the landscape surrounding the building. So this application had 248 objectors and 1 in favor. The objections were based on poor design, amenity issues, highways and parking, Section 106, infrastructure needs, trees, landscaping and loss of trees, loss of wildlife, air quality, affordable housing, not enough or not needed. It should not have been allocated in the local plan in the first place, according to some people, and will discourage tourists. So more details about the specific objections is in the report. And then following discussions by the parish council, a petition was also organized and submitted with further objections. Apologies. Water. Members will realize that although the application seeks to address these issues, the perception of the objectors is that it doesn't go far enough to provide the benefits, as opposed to not addressing these issues at all. Okay, so this is on page 8 of the report, if you're following along on the report, I mean. So there are a number of conditions in the report that were requested by our consultees. The parish council notably provided reluctant support on the basis that the site is allocated in the local plan. Importantly, the Highways Authority, after negotiations, had no objection if conditions were added and a Section 106 requirement met. Apologies. Getting a cold. And so this from the Highways Authority included widening the road to the south, Sprocket Road, to accommodate the congestion issues that this application would cause. Highways England similarly had no objections on the condition that no more than 250 dwellings on the site were occupied before the completion of the roundabout, again, to prevent any congestion problems. Natural England had no objection as long as the council was happy that the application met habitat regulations assessment requirements, which was then confirmed by the council's ecologists. A Section 106 package has been negotiated, which I will go into more detail later when discussing viability. Green space and play requirements negotiated. Historic England had no comments. More of these. Environment Agency, no comments. Drainage team agreed to sustainable urban drainage system. Solution is to have additional plots outside of the allocation, which was previously discussed, those bits of open land that were for drainage that were not a part of the allocation. And then further, rights of way, no objection if maintenance agreed. Oh, sorry. Police, no objection with conditions. Air quality, no assessment needed. Noise, happy with mitigation. Contamination, no objection with conditions. And active travel, no objections. So in assessing the application and coming to a recommendation, officers have taken into account a number of key policies in the local plan on this slide. I won't go through all of them in detail, but the most important ones are in particular ST1, which is specific for development in this part of the district called Capri, as well as A1, which is the policy that allocates this site. Also to note, as mentioned, DM1, which is the mix of housing requirement, but requires a mix of 2 and 3 bed housing, and notably does not require affordable housing. So taking all of this into account, this is the officer assessment. There are 2.1 hectares outside of the housing allocation that would have some harm to the character and appearance of the countryside and the countryside gap, but subsequently would allow for essential road widening works. The loss of agricultural land is not significant, as it is grade 3, not the best quality, and not a large quantity of agricultural land lost. Part of the allocated land not in the application site could be developed in the future, but also part is the orchard of, which is of environmental value, so development could be resisted on there. The design and layout generally accords with design brief and design codes, but this is also something that will be in reserved matters. Landscaping and open space provide sufficient landscape buffer. It is noted that it is a suggested 20 meters around the landscape buffer of the development, but due to the widening of Sprocket Road, it would be less than 20 meters. Local ecologists have still deemed that this is sufficient. And lastly, local facilities. As part of our negotiations, the developer has agreed to allocate some land and £200,000 to the construction of a convenience store. Again, the housing mix, the typologies are to be agreed in reserved matters, but affordable housing, there's no affordable housing for this application as there's no policy to require it. Residential amenity issues to be resolved at reserved matters stage, as the layout and all other reserved matters have not been agreed upon yet. Heritage as it relates to the listed building at the Jack Farmhouse. It was assessed that there will be less than substantial harm to the surrounding of the farmhouse, which would be mitigated by boundary landscaping and use of land nearest to the boundary as open space to try to mitigate this as much as possible. The ecology, it has been assessed that it is acceptable harm because mitigation is going to be carried out in the form of a 10% biodiversity net gain off-site. Highways, as discussed, improvements are necessary to accommodate the development, and these have been agreed with the developer to widen the road and create a roundabout. And wider landscape impacts, it is assessed that there are some adverse impacts, but it is not significant. And this is mostly relating to the plots of land that will be used for drainage. So, viability and section 106. So this is on page 22 of your report, paragraph 81. I'm going to discuss the contributions of the section 106 agreement. So this development, it has been agreed that contributions will consist of £3,100,000 for a new primary school, £42,300 for community learning contribution towards the Mondeo Adult Education Center, £26,300 youth services contribution, £33,600 library contribution, £42,700 social care contribution, £1,223,000 towards the road widening scheme at Sprocket Road, £245,000 towards public transport enhancements, the provision of a pedestrian and cycle link between the site and surrounding residential areas, the provision of bus stops either within the site or as improvements to those on Axel Hill Drive, £232,600 towards electric car charging points, £38,000 towards secure cycle storage, £604,800 towards the Capri Medical Center, £19,700 for the delivery of BNG off-site, an SPA mitigation contribution of £240 per dwelling, an off-site sports contribution of £160,000 for the provision of new changing rooms at the local rugby club, a contribution of £200,000 for the building costs towards the convenience store, and a section 106 management fee, £5,000. So the overall conclusion is that this application is not compliant with the local plan, but it has substantial wider benefits, such as substantial housing, road improvements, landscape enhancements, and other community benefits. So the suggestion is to grant the application subject to the completion of an appropriate Section 106 legal agreement, the further views of the landscape consultant, and conditions. Thank you. Sorry for my coughing.
Nina, thanks very much indeed for that, and we do hope you're feeling a bit better. We've got 3 public speakers on the application. Our first is the applicant, Mr. Kirkham. You're welcome. 3 minutes will be yours in your own time.
Thank you very much, Chair. And first of all, can I thank you for the opportunity to come and address members this afternoon. I appreciate the opportunity to do that. And to address you directly, further to making the representations that we made through the submission. First of all, Chair, I would like to say it's been a pleasure working with your officers to come to the final development scheme that we have, and we intend to deliver that as a well-rounded scheme beneficial to the area. And I'm grateful to your officers for working with us. I'd just like to emphasise a few points, if I may. Firstly, and perhaps most importantly, it's that the proposal is mainly on an adopted local plan site. It's site A1 in your local plan, and the council's agreed for that site to be developed as part of that process. That's been assessed by an inspector and found to be acceptable in its own right and suitable for a residential-led scheme. There are a few small areas outside the adopted local plan site in allocation. We accept that, but ask that you acknowledge that these would have very limited landscape impacts as accepted by your own officers and as outlined in our landscape strategy. In one case where we propose some housing, the additional area is bounded on 3 sites by the allocated site in any case, and so development on that area wouldn't have an impact. And in the other cases, there wouldn't be any development at all. It's for the areas for the drainage delivery. The application's in outline, and the final detail will be subject to reserve matters applications, which we're very happy to work with the council on to come to a scheme that we can all be happy with in development and it being built out. As you know, the council is required to have an up-to-date housing land supply, and everyone acknowledges that your position at the moment is pretty precarious. and that's acknowledged by your own officers in the report that's been prepared for you. By approving our scheme this afternoon, you'd significantly help the delivery of that housing in Ford and at the same time ease your own housing supply position. Our scheme will bring with it various transport benefits, as your officers have outlined in their report to you. We've already gifted some land to enable the roundabout to be constructed at Axel Hill Drive, and through the application we can ensure the additional benefits can be delivered along Sprocket Road, allowing the National Productivity Investment Funding to be unlocked and deliver those improvements in time to meet the 2026 deadline. There's no policy requirement in this case to provide affordable housing on the site, but we have decided to include a few affordable units anyway. But over and above that, the development would create much needed family housing for the residents of Capri in line with your own housing mix aspirations. I would like to emphasise, Chair, there's no objections from the National Highways, Natural England, Historic England, Environment Agency or any other internal consultees. And finally, Chair, in closing, I'm personally committed to delivering the scheme in line with your local plan, and will deliver good quality sustainable housing in Ford and contribute to local infrastructure needs. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much. And are there any questions for the applicant at this stage? For clarification. Yes.
Just on your delivery of affordable housing, you're talking about affordable housing but no social housing. What is your reasoning behind not being able to deliver more social housing in this area?
We're just following the policy that you've put in your local plan, Chair. We've had discussions with the officers about this, and they've confirmed that there is no requirement for affordable housing in this case. But as I've said, we're keen to do our bit for the local community. So we have got some first homes, 6 first homes proposed in the scheme. And in terms of the mix, we're following almost completely your housing mix in your local plan. So we think that we're going a long way to meet exactly what you want in this part of Ford. We're doing our best to provide the scheme that you want, that's set out in your local plan.
Thanks. Are we okay to move on? Last chance. Oh, yes, of course.
Thank you, Chair. A question is, how long do you envisage it will be before the school and the shopping area on the site are constructed and that the majority of these Section 106 monies are paid over?
We've been in discussion, Chair, with your officers, and we've come up with a projection that the community facilities will be within the first phase, so about 270 houses. We'll deliver that. We'll give the money towards the provision of that. The land will be there. We're not going to build it for you. We can't afford to do that, unfortunately, but we're doing everything we can to deliver that, and following discussion with your officers. And we're committed to delivering that over £6 million worth of package for all the other social infrastructure that you want. We're really keen to produce a really good development here. We're committed to it. I'm a local guy, and I just want to invest in the community.
Okay, we'll move on then to our next speaker, the ward member, if you'd like to come and join us. Good to have you with us. Again, 3 minutes will be yours, and in your own time, Councillor.
Thank you, Chair. I welcome the opportunity to speak to you all today. I'm the local ward member for the area, and I'd just like to say that this application has raised a considerable amount of opposition from local residents. You know, those people that are born and raised in this area and see this as the systematic destruction of the countryside. I have an obligation to put forward their views as a local member and their elected representative. Firstly, I'd just like to ask why 700 houses are proposed when the application and local plan policy clearly states 620. This is not in accordance with the policy. Also, we've just seen that parts of the application site, the allocated site, aren't even part of this development, so that's going to be more houses in the future. To me, that can't comply with policy A1, it just smacks of developer greed. Members in all good conscience should not be allowing this development where 2.1 hectares are outside the application site. Agricultural land in this country is under significant development pressures. You know, where are we going to grow our food? if land is completely and increasingly being developed. There's no affordable housing approved as part of this development, and we've just heard from the applicant it's a token gesture of 6. You know, our residents are living in appalling housing conditions on the street because they can't afford to get onto the property ladder. You know, this is not about local people. Where are the houses for our children to be making their own way in life? I'd suggest that policy DM1 is just not fit for purpose, and we should be referring up to the MPPF. On to traffic. You know, the traffic problems in this area are only going to be worsened by this development. I know how difficult it is to get out onto Axel Hill Drive, and that's without 700 additional houses in this area, all of whom will have 2 or 3 cars. It's an accident waiting to happen. It's also totally unrealistic to expect the new residents to cycle or use local bus services rather than cars. The roads are already dangerous, and no one will cycle, and the bus services are terrible, so everyone's just going to rely on their vehicles. The development will also ruin the landscape and the views that existing residents enjoy. People have bought houses in this area because of the views and the sense of a countryside location, and that destroys everything that they've worked for and invested in. The development will destroy wildlife in the area. You know, the days of bird watching and looking at butterflies. You know, concrete in the countryside will decimate local wildlife. I remember when I was younger, you know, bird watching and picking apples from the orchards and just being outside and not sat at a computer gaming. You know, like a proper childhood. Where are these kids going to play? This development will just discourage visitors. It's ugly and congested. You know, our businesses rely on visitors to this area who come enjoy its peaceful tranquility. No one will want to visit this blot on the landscape. Capri honestly deserves better than this development. It's too big, it's in the wrong place, existing residents don't want it, and it's not for them. Thank you, Chair. One final point. We've heard the case officer actually say that this is contrary to policy, so I'd be very grateful if you'd actually go with that recommendation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Councillor. And our final speaker, I do beg your pardon. Let me proceed there. Any questions for the ward councillor in clarification? Stunned silence. Okay, thank you very much. And our final speaker, you're welcome again. 3 minutes will be yours, and in your own time.
Yeah. Hello. I'm speaking on behalf of the local residents of Capri. I'm their nominated spokesperson. When the so-called consultation on this site was done, the residents and the parish council objected to this land being built on, and that was for 620 houses. But now it's 700, and on additional farmland that was never mentioned at the time. We haven't been consulted about that. No one has asked us about that. If this development goes ahead, local people can't afford one of these houses. There's no affordable homes, 6. I mean, it's laughable, isn't it? 6. No local connection properties, no old people's bungalows on a development of 700 houses. It's shameful. It's shameful. This development isn't interested in the community. It's only interested in profit. This will end up being a soulless housing estate for commuters who just want easy access to the motorway. The new people will want their kids in the school here and want to register with the surgery, but there's no room at either. The classes are full and we struggle to get appointments now. We want to know when this new school is likely to be built. Is the land available now? Has it got planning permission? What happens if this developer doesn't deliver this? We've heard about other developers going bust before these benefits are ever delivered. It seems to our community that this application's being rushed through to secure this big funding pot for this new junction and some road improvements. Is that why it's being imposed on the community? A few million quid for a bit of road? Shame the funding isn't for the potholes. You'd get support for that. This new road isn't going to deal with the congestion in the town. It'll be more folk using the town as a rat run. There are queues everywhere now. You can never get the kids to school on time. It's too dangerous to ride a bike, and we end up walking in the road because the car's parked on the pavements. You want to fix the existing road system and give some safe cycling and walking routes first. Sort out the issues we have now, not add another 700 car-owning households to make it 1,000,000 times worse. As for this Section 106 money, outside the grant for the new bit of road and the surgery in the school, if it ever gets delivered, it works out a couple of grand per house. That's the benefit for the community. Is that it? A couple of £1,000 per house? They're making profits everywhere. Is that what these people have to cough up to deliver on land that's our countryside? It makes a mockery of the system. The report says that some of the land is in flood zones 2 and 3. Well, that doesn't sound too good, does it? It'll all flood once they tear out the hedgerows and the trees. You see it on the news all the time. And all those habitats will be lost. We've got owls and bats and badgers on that land. They'll all be displaced or worse. Replanting doesn't offset that. And as for Jack's Farm and the orchard, Jack's Farm is a listed building, you know, it's our heritage. In many ways, Capri has grown up around it. We should be preserving this place for the future so we don't lose sight of our history, literally lose sight of it behind these boxes they're building. Same goes for the orchard at Jack's Chase. That was supposed to be protected as part of this allocation, but not now. We suppose that means it will be cleared and someone will want to build new houses on that, more soulless boxes. What will you do to stop that from happening? No one will be handing out apples to the kids once that goes. That will be the end of another tradition in our community. We know we can't stop the development on the allocated site being built on, but we can fight to protect the rest. And you make the right decision because there's an election coming.
Thank you very much indeed. Any questions to this speaker?
If you dare.
Are you available to either?
No. Okay, thank you very much indeed. And it's now open to the committee for comments and questions to our officers. Who wants to? Yep.
Thank you, Chair. A couple of questions and points, please. I agree with the last speaker, and we have personal experience of it just not very far from this building. When will the school be built? The school is not identified on the site parameters plan as far as I can see. And that leads me to my next question. How relevant is the site parameters plan, given this is an outline application with all matters reserved except for access? And so what ends up being built could be substantially different from what is proposed. It could be well more than 700 houses. Has that been considered by officers? Those both questions. How will the school be actually delivered? And how will the development be controlled? Please.
Gareth, can you take our colleague through that, please?
Thank you, Councillor. So just to remind members exactly what the Section 106 agreement has agreed, or would be agreed if we gave permission to this application. So it would see £3.1 million financial contribution by the developer to build what would be a new primary school. So if members approve this application, that would be signed as part of a legally enforceable Section 106 agreement. The actual location and timing of that building, Councillor's quite correct, has not yet been confirmed, and that would be part of the next stage of the application process as part of a master plan that we would require the developer to develop for us before we brought this back for reserved matters.
And the other question was on, I think, the reserved matters in terms of numbers. Yes, we've got an outline today. It perhaps might be worth going through the difference between an outline and a reserved matters application, perhaps to give our colleagues some reassurance, possibly, in terms of what may come back at the next application were we to approve this today.
Yeah, so as Nina, our case officer, pointed out, this is an outline application, so details would be for a future decision under reserved matters. The key details that we obviously would agree today are the principle of development and the access points as they were pointed out by the case officer. However, as part of the application, the developer has brought forward a development brief and site parameter plan, and although that does not identify, identify and set the layout of what the final scheme would look like, it does include key principles like the buffer along Sprocket Road, like the level and amount of open space, 12.5 hectares of open space, the typologies of the open space, so as well as kind of nature corridors and ecological corridors, informal and formal play space as well, and the drainage locations as well, and the retail store. So although the details of the layout wouldn't be agreed, we would be expecting a reserved matters application to come forward in line with the principles that are set out in the development brief and site development plan that our officers have been considering.
Does that answer your
Well,
question?
nearly, but we have no way of enforcing that to happen, have we? Should the developer decide to submit further justification for increased housing yet again, or changes of layout, bear in mind this will take a number of years to deliver, and could be done in phases, with each one subject to detailed application and variation thereof. What is actually built could be nothing like what we see in front of us today.
I think that's true of any reserved matters, outline application. The whole point is, if we were to agree this, the detail wouldn't be agreed today. It would be for us as a committee to agree or not what comes later. So how much of that later consideration, if any, Gareth, can we bring into our consideration today, and how far would our hands be tied, if at all, next time by agreeing to what's in front of us today?
I think our hands wouldn't be tied, in so much as we aren't agreeing the detail as we've agreed. However, what we would expect and what we would ask members to look for in a reserved matters application are for the lengths to which the principles that we're agreeing today are followed through and delivered in the master plan, and therefore that would be a consideration for us to be able to judge our decision at the right time when that comes forward.
But that would be the committee's decision.
Yes, that would be the
next time.
Yeah.
Okay. Who's next? Yep, colleague at the end.
Thank you. Can I ask officers why they feel it necessary to go outside the policy and increase the numbers of housing from 620 up to 700 and go outside the policy that we've agreed for this council?
Yeah. I suppose the thing I would say, and I'll defer to my colleague here for the specifics, but the point I would make is that I think the local plan policy is for a minimum of 620 houses. It's not a maximum figure, and so officers were able to bear that in mind when assessing it. And secondly, the application is for a maximum of 700 rather than for 700 dwellings. I think that so the numbers are really important. They're indications rather than fixed numbers at this stage. There are a number of complicated issues relating to viability and the viability of the site, and including the gift of land for widening Sprocket Road, which is under the ownership of a different landowner, and as part of negotiations to make that viable, officers agreed that an extension outside the actual local plan allocation would be a sensible solution to try and find the kind of bring forward land that would enable us to widen Sprocket Road and kind of provide the number of houses that would make this viable. Do you want to elaborate?
Thanks, Gareth. I think just to add to that as well, members need to have regard to the fact that the council doesn't have 5-year housing land supply. Therefore, the National Planning Policy Framework requires development to be considered in line with what's called a tilted balance. So what the ultimate test is this a sustainable development? Obviously, officers have had to give weight to the fact that the majority of the land is allocated in the local plan, and then the question is whether the harm that arises from going slightly beyond that allocation outweighs the benefits of the scheme, and significant weight does need to be given to the benefit of additional housing in that circumstance. Thank you.
Thanks. Who's next? Yep.
Thank you, Chair. I'd like a bit of clarification, if I may. Looking at page 10, talking about the consultee drainage scheme, they look specifically at surface water drainage. 700 properties translates into 1,600 persons at a 2.4 person per house typical figure. There's no mention of wastewater treatment. Should there not be some consideration of whether the local treatment plant is adequate or not? There seems to be no mention, it's been glossed over.
That's a very good point, Councillor, isn't it? I think as part of our normal process of consulting water companies, we would have expected any problems like that to be flagged up by the water company, who would be responsible for taking drainage, wastewater drainage off the site. As you say, the drainage schemes that are indicated in the layout plan are for surface water and surface runoff rather than foul water and foul waste. So we have undertaken the usual consultation with all stakeholders and consultees and not had any issues raised about the capacity of local facilities to take that on. And I can see my colleague from the rear of the room.
Just on that, if I may, Chair, the site was considered as part of the local plan process, and during that process we would have consulted with the various statutory consultees, including the Waste Disposal Authority.
That's part of the allocation process in drawing up the policy.
So we
Thanks. Who's next? You've come back, yeah?
Yeah, one final question, Chair. Something
Like your optimism there.
something you alluded to sort of struck a chord with me. Did I hear you say, or did I hear somebody say, the guy next to you, that the developer does not own this land and hopes to acquire the land, particularly the land of the roundabout, in which case how can the developer guarantee to deliver this scheme if they don't own all the land? We have personal, in this authority currently outside here, a roundabout which we tried to deliver some years ago, might be deferred because of ownership issues. It's of concern to me that if the developer does not own the land, how can they guarantee to develop the scheme? Thank you.
Well, if I can talk about, obviously I defer to colleagues for any historical cases here, but certainly this scheme is under the ownership of several different landowners, and there has been extensive negotiations between the landowners and the developer, but also in partnership with the council as well. So as part of the Section 106 agreement, we are looking to get the assurance that we can, that the different land kind of deals and contributions, so contribution for the road widening and road improvements, as well as contributions for the convenience store and the school, would be insured through the Section 106 agreement.
Would that be a pre-commencement type condition?
Yeah, we're looking to agree the Section 106 agreement through this outline stage before reserve matters.
So there wouldn't be any sort of halfway, let's build half of it and then we get stuck with half a development, half a roundabout, etc.
Yeah. I mean, if we look at our report, paragraphs 53 to 66 on the highways considerations of this application point out, I believe, that the developer has agreed that the improvements to Sprocket Road and the landscape buffer are in place before construction starts on housing. So we've tried to prioritise some of those features as far as we can through the legal agreement.
Thanks, Garreth. Yes, colleague there.
Do officers not consider 700 houses being placed in front of a listed building to be considerable harm? I'd like to know where you get the balance, please.
I think Nina explained in her presentation that although the site that's under consideration does butt up against the Jack Farm, the listed building. The current, the indicative site layout that we see in front of us wouldn't include development right up to the edge of that boundary, and so there would be some green space to preserve the setting of the listed building. And importantly, Jack Farm lies adjacent to the former orchard, which is not part of the development, and under the local plan policy we would seek to conserve as green space given its important environmental value.
Can I just add to that? Paragraph 45 states that any built form on the development would be 100 meters away from the building, and between that and the listed building there will be landscape boundaries to mitigate the impact of the development.
If I can just chip in, the other important thing for members to consider is that the statutory consultee, Historic England, haven't objected to the application, so and also considered the impact to be less than substantial harm, so that's also a relevant consideration.
Thanks. Yes.
Thank you. Right, I'm just looking at, basically regards to two of the speakers that have spoke on this application, regarding the amount of affordable housing that's being produced on this site. And I'm just looking at policy DM1, which it states that it doesn't require developments in Mondale to deliver affordable housing. But at the end of that, it does state there is scope under the policy DM1 to reconsider this position if the particular characteristics of a development or economic conditions allow so. Has this been fully considered with regard to delivering more affordable housing, which from the two speakers that have obviously spoken earlier is clearly a need?
Yeah, I appreciate that this affordable housing is a really important point for members, and officers worked hard with the developer to explore the options in this area. You quite rightly say our local plan doesn't require affordable housing in this part of the borough because of the land values and viability issues. But as part of the application, we did request a viability appraisal of the proposal. That viability appraisal was given to us, and we commissioned an expert consultant to appraise that on our behalf. And the conclusion of that independent consultant assessment is that the application scheme is the only viable proposal when it comes to the financials of the site. This is the conclusion of that was that viability is marginally positive based on an 18% return for the developer, which, although 18% sounds generous in kind of regional and national scales, that's still quite a modest return for a housing scheme of this type. And that although this doesn't allow for affordable housing, the provision of 6 first homes, so homes for first-time buyers as part of the scheme, was as far as the independent expert considered would keep the scheme viable.
Could officers just run through page 19, 59, because that sounds quite worrying to me.
Like, see, we've read the report. Yeah, paragraph 59 is a critical point that perhaps we haven't covered as deeply as we should have done.
Councillors always read reports. Of course. You should know that.
So essentially, the improvements to Sprocket Road are part of an ongoing programme of which this application would contribute a significant amount. So works to improve the roundabout and put in place that roundabout that Nina mentioned have been undertaken or underway. The second phase, to widen the road and bring it up to national standards to cater for the increased traffic of housing on this site, is going to be benefited from 3.2 million of central government money from the National Productivity Investment Fund. Now, the deadline for spending that grant from central government is April 2026, and so the 3.2 million Section 106 contribution that this scheme would provide the council would enable us to deliver those road improvements, utilise the grant, and ensure that those highway improvements were made in a way that meant that the council didn't lose the 1.2 million of central government grant. Does that explain your query, councillor?
It explains it, but I'm a little worried about the timing.
Yes, I think the key thing here is that the timeline is very tight. Completing and the road improvements and utilising that grant by April 2026 is a significant issue for us as officers, and obviously a kind of significant issue for the developer to enable this site. The loss of that £1.2 million grant would be a significant consideration for the developer in delivering this scheme.
Come back in. Okay, sure. Any more? Who's next? Yes, colleague.
Thank you. We were told in the reports that a small amount of money is being given to local health centre to provide additional places, and you know, obviously there's going to be, as we've heard, in 700 properties, a massive increase in the population. Has there been any comment from the health centre about whether that money is adequate? Is it sufficient? Can they use that to meet the needs, and will there be improved facilities with regard to local doctors and health facilities?
Would you?
Thank you, councillor. So as part of this application, like other major applications, we consult the NHS, the Integrated Care Board, and they have come back in response to the application. So their contribution, around £200,000, is it? Sorry, is based on a formula which is applied nationwide in terms of they anticipate the additional population increase, and then look at the local surgery in this case, and assess what modifications are required. It's not always extension. Sometimes it will be alteration, reconfiguration of existing space, and they consider that the contribution that they're seeking would provide that adequate mitigation.
Is that yes? Yeah. Thanks. Anybody else? I don't want to say last chance, but I think we are reaching the end, and I don't want to have anybody feel they didn't have a chance to contribute or ask anything yet.
Just one related point. You mentioned at the beginning the new announcements being made on planning by the new government. I picked up one which was made, which seemed to indicate that the reliance on design guides for housing could well be removed in order to increase the speed of build. Would we have to consider that in our thoughts? Because at the moment we're assured that we're going to follow the council's agreed design guides in any further development, or in the in the further applications which will follow this outline.
That's a really topical question. Thank you. Yeah. So I'm probably not in a position to comment on what the current government is saying about design codes and design guides, but I would refer you to paragraph 17 onwards about the design and layout of the proposed development. So our local plan in policy A1, which allocates this site, does require a kind of strong landscape framework to ensure that the scheme doesn't impact negatively on the wider landscape. So as well as woodland buffers and buffers to the boundary of the site, retaining hedgerows and trees and other features within the site. But importantly, the design, the policy in the local plan as well would require a kind of high quality housing in line with our local plan policy. Obviously, it's very difficult for me to say whether the government would introduce a new consideration, but I think we would have to take that into consideration when we consider the reserved matters. At the moment, we can only consider what's in front of us in terms of our own local policy.
But looking at the design, which our colleague obviously was hinting at, will be a material factor for us when, if we were to approve this and the reserved matters comes back.
That's correct, Chair, yes. Yeah.
Thanks. Nobody else? Last chance. Okay. Well, listen. Thanks for the questions and a really healthy debate there, I think. Turning to the front of the report on page 3, you'll see the recommendation from our officers is to grant permission, subject to the conditions and the completion of the 106 agreement, which we've heard about and certainly asked about as well. That's the recommendation. Is anybody happy to move that? That's what's been put in front of us by our officers. I'm not quite sure how we normally do things here, or are we just happy then to vote for or against the recommendation? Yeah. Yeah. So that's the recommendation that's put forward today or come from the officers. Obviously, we need to take a decision one way or the other, or to defer for that matter. So, who's got any thoughts as to how we proceed at this stage? Yes, colleague there.
Thank you. Yeah, I'd like to see around me. I'll take part. Yeah, I think like I fully take on board what the local member and the local person, the local resident said and about their concerns, but I'm struggling to go against these officers' recommendations after listening to the replies to the questions that's been asked. I think, like you say, there's the housing supply issue. We've got to have these houses. It is allocated for a minimum. I think it says 620. That were my concern, but like you say, that's not the maximum. We can go above that, and the 700 is a maximum, so it might not be that many. So from my behalf, I'll move the recommendations of the officers.
Okay, is that seconded? Thanks. So that's the motion that we've got before us, and that will be open for debate. If anyone's got any views as to following that or not following that, now is your chance. Yeah. How would that normally work then? Or how would we word it to take on board the point?
Well, I think the report, towards the end of the report, there are a number of pre-commencement conditions. And obviously these include a range of issues. As part of the pre-commencement works, we would normally be expecting to agree the Section 106 agreement as delegated by this committee. I suppose there would be an option to agree that the final kind of shape of that is discussed with officers and the chair on your behalf to agree it. But I just wondered if there was a specific issue that you feel hasn't been covered.
Can we use the mics, please? Thank you.
Microphone, thanks.
Sorry. You'd be looking at this and saying, yes, okay, it falls outside the local plan because it's too big and its outline. But nevertheless, a lot of the promises made by the developer would support. You know, if you're going to build something, it would support it in terms of things that have been outlined. So that's why I'm saying, I'm taking into account comments have been made about social housing, etc. So that's why I'm saying, can the 106 come back to this committee in some shape for final consideration or debate or approval or amendment? Is that possible under the rules?
So the the report, as is set out, that details the mitigation measures that officers and the relevant statutory consultees consider necessary to mitigate the impact of the development. So our recommendation is based on that Section 106 package as detailed in the report. I think it's reasonable to include within the recommendation that any variation to that is delegated to officers but subject to the approval of the chair. But the balance of the considerations is something that's resulted in the Section 106 package as presented in the report. So if there was any disagreement about how that balance had been drawn up, then that may well have implications for the 106. So essentially, it can be delegated to officers via chair for minor amendments, but any significant changes would alter the balance.
Is your worry that we might approve something that you're, in inverted commas, happy with, and by the time negotiations finish, it looks substantially different?
Yes. Is there a mechanism by which it's not just in consultation with, I understand non-material amendments, but if it's material, in the judgment of the chair, to come back for further, is that possible under the rules?
I don't think that's an unreasonable proposition because the balance, I suppose what I was trying to explain is that the balance that officers have come to is based on the package as is set out. So if there was a significant change to that, for example, the developer tried to make a case that one of the elements of the contribution, take health for example, wasn't viable, that would change the planning balance because then there isn't mitigation in that respect. So officers will be looking to bring that back potentially with a different recommendation.
I think the important thing is, given it's before the committee, which we're giving it, although we're not bound by partisan politics here today, we're giving it political oversight. It's having that extra stage, were we to approve the application and the negotiations start between ourselves and the developer or the applicant, that has some form of political oversight too. I think that's the...
So my final point, I'm happy that if it's non-material, it's just dealt with by the chair in consultation and the officers. But is this something that you would need to do as an motion or amend the motion to ensure that if it was beyond materiality, it did come back to this committee? Or is this just automatic, it just happens anyway?
One option open to members would be to set a time limit on the discussions with the applicant so that those discussions in terms of the Section 106 agreement from an officer perspective will be based entirely on what's written in the report. So the contributions that are written down will be those that we seek. If there was either any change in the applicant's position, or if after 6 months, for argument's sake, those negotiations haven't resulted in a signed Section 106 agreement, we could bring it back.
And would 6 months be a reasonable period of time then, in your opinion?
Yes.
So it's not challenged legally, okay.
Yes.
Sorry.
Well, I'll bring in a second. Do we need then to... We've got a suggestion to approve the application subject to the conditions and the 106. Do we need some form of amendment to that to incorporate?
I propose an amendment. I take the officers, there isn't a monitoring a legal officer here, but I take the officers' drafting on it, but in substance, what it is if you've gone beyond the 180 degrees, it's just a mechanism to bring it back so you can look at where you are with the discussions on 106 to make sure the developer is delivering what they promise.
So I'm not seeing any great shaking of heads to that, so I'll take that as an amendment that we'll agree. Obviously, we've still yet to vote on the application. We've still got the now amended motion to approve, which has been moved and seconded. Is there any further thoughts on that before we progress? Yes.
Thank you, Chair. Regarding the phasing conditions and the pre-start conditions and the prior to occupation conditions, it seems to me that all the highway improvement works will not be commenced or indeed put in place before work commences on site. Up to 250 dwellings will be constructed before the final highway works are required to be done, and that's the junction to M7 under the strategy. And as one of my colleagues has already mentioned, and as the objector mentioned, I would not like to see the council swayed by the need to get hold of the grant funding for wider highway works, make this development be put forward before it's ready to actually be put forward. Thank you.
I think the highway or completion of highway works is a preoccupation condition. Is that right? Looking at page 26.
That's correct, yeah. The condition towards the end of the report is that it's preoccupation rather than pre-commencement.
So it could be, they could be built, but they won't be allowed to have people move in and occupy the dwellings before the roadworks are done. As I read it, anyway.
Yeah, that's correct.
No, sorry. That's highway works between. That's completion of all highway works and works between dwellings. Yes. It would appear that that is the case, but then the phasing condition says that no more than 250 dwellings on site shall be occupied until the M7 Junction 5 Roads Investment Strategy Scheme has been implemented.
Yeah.
Could I draw your attention to paragraph 57? And thank you for kind of just verifying my thinking on this, Councillor. It's much appreciated. But you see that paragraph 57 towards the end there states that as part of the terms of the Section 106 agreement, the land required for road widening would be provided at no cost to the council and rights of access for widening before any development would take place on the application site. So it does make sure that that land is there to be able to be kind of improve the highway before development takes place.
Thank you very much.
That's helpful, thanks. Any more for any more? No, don't want to, again, cut anybody off. We've got the motion before us then, which is to grant the planning permission subject to the conditions and subject to the Section 106 agreement, which we've spoken about the referral back if necessary. Are we ready to vote on that? Okay, that's the recommendation which has been moved and seconded. So all those in favour of that, please.
Sorry, Chair,
yeah.
just for, again, sort of reality's sake, we would normally use the online voting system, but perhaps we actually take a roll call, which is something which we'd also do of the members.
If that's what you do, yes, by all means.
Okay, then.
Is that you that does?
Yes, it is
that's
indeed,
fine,
yes.
yep, no problem.
So then, you heard the motion. Councillor Barker. Councillor Cooper. Councillor Liggett. Councillor Peterson. Councillor Rouse. Councillor Hartshorn. Councillor Smith. Councillor Pickering. Councillor Baker.
Against.
Councillor Jones.
Against.
And Councillor Welton.
Haven't you forgotten someone?
Probably.
Do I not
Oh,
vote?
yourself? Yes.
Yes,
certainly.
I will vote for.
Yeah. Good
I tell you
point.
what, if they didn't let the chair vote in my favour.
Right then, Chair. 10 for and 2 against. The motion is carried.
So I'll declare that carried. Thank you very much indeed, everybody. And I think we can probably get unanimous consent for the fact we'd like a break at this point. So thank you very much. And Gareth, do you perhaps want to say something before we do that?
Yeah, I feel like we've been well questioned. I don't know about you, David and Nina. I think some really insightful and probing questions. I hope we did our job in answering them as well as we could. You tested my reading of the report. But thanks also to our speakers. Did a really great job. I think that really helped. Certainly helped my understanding and hopefully kind of really gave a bit of colour to your average officer's report, which is much needed. This case study came from a few years ago from a different part of the country, somewhere down south in the southeast, in a very different geography to this. So do we want to find out what really happened in real life? Oh, you do, are you? Right, okie dokie. So the decision of the Real Planning Committee. So what actually happened, can I mention it because it isn't public? This is Swale Borough Council in Kent. I don't know if you've ever been down to Faversham and that part of the world. It's very, very pretty, but interestingly, quite similar to where we are. It's got some industrial areas, it's got some beautiful open countryside, but it's got lots of kind of, you know, former industrial dockside areas by the Thames and a lot of viability issues as well. So actually quite an interesting case study for us in this part of the world too. But essentially, the committee there, they voted against the officer recommendations and took a decision to defer their decision on the actual application to allow officers to advise members on the prospect of appeal success and what risks it raised. This list here identifies the concerns that members had. So loss of agricultural land. I noticed that didn't come up this afternoon. Obviously, this is a site that was allocated in the local plan. So the loss of the majority of agricultural land, although it's a material consideration, it is something that is supported by local plan policy. And I think, as Nina explained, there are three extra plots beyond the allocation that would mean a loss of, I think it's something like another 10 hectares of agricultural land. So potentially significant. Loss of countryside gap. So as we heard, the protection of important countryside gaps was a policy in the local plan, and by kind of extending beyond the local plan allocation, the proposal that we've considered does lose additional countryside in an important gap between two settlements. Also development outside of the settlement boundary. So the local plan in the real case drew a new settlement boundary to include the allocation in the local plan, and obviously the application that we've been talking about goes slightly beyond that. I think there was also lots of questions on the viability as well. Some sneaking suspicion by members when this was considered that they didn't really believe the viability assessment and were sceptical about some of the viability limits that were in the evidence that was presented to them. Although the application included, I think, something like 12 hectares of open land within the site. So as Nina said, it's kind of serving in providing enough open land for the new houses. Members, when they considered it, thought that there was an insufficient amount of open space provided. Lack of affordable housing, that did come up, and I think it's really important that we did discuss that. And that clearly is a difficult issue because affordable housing requirement wasn't supported by local plan policy, and the viability assessment suggested that that was a reasonable thing. But in the case, as it happened in Kent, members felt that the lack of affordable housing was a significant concern in their decision. And also a general point that was made then, that there was a belief that there was sufficient housing sites in their district to mean that the extensions weren't required. So a whole range of concerns that members raised when they discussed this application in real life. So following the deferral, a second report came to committee, and this was the kind of officers' analysis and advice on their concerns. So again, officers re-emphasised the fact that they felt that the harm to the listed building and the setting of the building was less than substantial, and I think we did explore that a little bit earlier this afternoon, didn't we? And why officers came to that conclusion that the setting was being preserved. Officers also made that point that Nina made earlier this afternoon, that although the application would see a loss of further agricultural land than that envisaged in the local plan, it wasn't the best and most versatile. It's grade 3 agricultural land. The officers advised to members in Kent as well that the landscape impact was acceptable in the officer's view, and obviously this is one of those interesting things. It's a material consideration, but it's one that requires judgment, and this was the officer's judgment. The analysis by the officer as well was that although the site that was under consideration, the application was slightly bigger than the actual allocation. The additional open space that was provided in the proposal was sufficient to meet the needs. And as we discussed at length, that was a good question about Section 106, that the Section 106 does meet the infrastructure requirements, and they had a community infrastructure levy as well. I don't think we've got that in North East Derbyshire, have we? So it's not relevant. But basically, they were saying that the contributions by the developer through Section 106 was reasonable and compliant with their normal policy. They re-emphasised the fact that the lack of affordable housing was backed up by the viability study and was policy compliant. And the officers also pointed out that bringing forward this application, allowing development, would meet the wider infrastructure requirements of the area. As we heard from the case officer, Sprocket Road. Yes, Sprocket Road. Sorry, I should have said at the outset, all the place names have been changed to be car themed. Do you mind to pick that up, really, mightn't you? So that's because the officer who did this case study for us is called Peter Ford. I don't know if you know, he's a very experienced case. So we followed that theme, so forgive me. But yeah, so basically this Sprocket Road infrastructure improvements were kind of required for the wider area as well, and this scheme would have helped deliver that. And as Nina said when she was acting as case officer, those improvements would address existing congestion too. Importantly, and I appreciate that 5-year or 4-year housing land supply isn't necessarily relevant to you because you've got a local plan in place and you've got land supply in place, and your housing delivery test is always very positive, isn't it, from my reading of the data. In the council where this happened, in between the members deferring the decision and the officers coming back, the amount of housing supply in that area fell below 4 years. And it was 4 years because they had a local plan that was in development with a spatial policy and suggested allocation. So they didn't need the full 5 years supply, but they had a 4 years supply when members first considered this application, but that situation changed following a further study by the council. And therefore, with all that kind of consideration, officers advised that there were strong risks of costs being awarded against the council if they refused this scheme and it was allowed at an appeal, and particularly because the council didn't have that housing land supply as required by NPPF. Despite that advice and despite officers' recommendations, members in this local authority made a decision to refuse the application for those following reasons. So as we said, demonstrable harm to the open, undeveloped character of the area and the landscape and harmful to the important local and countryside gap, as we discussed. Failing to secure a sufficient setting to Jack Farmhouse. I know we had a question about that, but the members in this case didn't feel that that was sufficient. The scheme also, they believed, fails to make provision for affordable housing, and despite it being compliant with the local plan, cited this as a reason for refusal. And finally, that the transport improvements offered to address capacity on the local roads were not sufficient to mitigate the harm caused by several hundred new homes. So that obviously those reasons were submitted as a kind of basis for refusing, despite the officer recommendations. And this is where we can hand out our first. Thank you. Alan will hand out our first press coverage, because as you can imagine, local people, particularly local residents and those angry objectors that we heard today, were very pleased and very grateful, you might say, to local members who refused this decision. So we refused this application. And I don't know if you've got a minute just to read that press coverage, but you can see it generated a lot of positive press for the decision locally. However, as officers pointed out, and maybe as you can guess as well, the developer, the applicant, did go to appeal and a public inquiry was held. Now, the council, because because of some of the reasons that were given for refusal were not seen to be sound, the council did not defend the reasons given on affordable housing or highways, because legal advice that they took suggested that they wouldn't be able to do that. So they kind of defended on just 2 of the 4 reasons that were given for refusal. However, the evidence provided by the applicant on landscape character, one of the reasons for refusal, led the inspector to conclude that although there would be some impact, it wouldn't be any greater than if the application complied completely with the local plan policy. And the other reason for refusal, impact on listed building. Here the inspector referred to the heritage statement, which demonstrated that the proposal as presented would preserve the listed farmhouse setting. So, as I say, there were 4 reasons for refusal. 2 of them couldn't be defended by the council at the public inquiry, and the 2 that were defended, the inspector found against them. And so, the inspector made that decision. And as you can see, that's a very clever word, and that just tries to balance out these reasons and the thinking behind it. So I agree with the council and the appellant that the provision of up to 700 dwellings carries substantial weight. Planning permission should be granted unless any adverse impacts of doing so would significantly and demonstrably outweigh the benefits when assessed against the policies in the framework taken as a whole. I have considered the proposal in the context of the presumption in favour of development. Not only that, the inspector also made a decision around the costs being awarded to the developer as well. So the developer was awarded partial costs to cover the costs of the inquiry on the basis that the reasons for refusing on affordable housing and highways were unreasonable. So it wasn't just the fact that the decision, the appeal was upheld. It was the fact that the decision made was based on some what the inspector would call unreasonable basis. Does that? Have people got any questions about that and what that might involve? Because now we can have the second press release, and this is a contrast in how life can change for a planning committee. It can move from hero to zero in no time at all. Because of course, once the inspector had made that decisions and imposed costs on the council, the local press line changed completely. And so Ford Council were accused of wasting taxpayers' cash following the Axel Hill Drive appeal defeat in court. So all of a sudden, you know, maybe not the same people, but certainly a substantial amount of people were criticising the council for a very different reason. So I suppose that just opens it up to discussion really, and what we think we've learned from that, and whether we think we've, you know, in some ways your decision, it's not necessarily right or wrong, but your decision seems to be the wise one in light of the experience of the case study local authority. Has anyone got any questions? Does anyone feel that the inspector's decision was unreasonable? We did have a couple of people objecting to this decision, didn't we? I don't know if you've got any comments on that. No,
Yeah.
not at all.
Yeah, please.
Okay, thank you very much, Chair. Yeah, it was essentially down to the developer just wanting to vary the red line on the local plan. But the members who refused it went off on what turned out to be the wrong tack in trying to refuse it, 2 of which they couldn't defend. So they were in a bad place once they started, hadn't they, really? Yeah. Once they went to appeal and couldn't justify 2 of the reasons they'd gone to appeal, that was bad. but they didn't, in my view, from what we can see, they didn't explore fully the effects of increasing the red line for housing development, and the council was at fault by not having a housing supply, sufficient housing supply. So again, whoever advised them to go to appeal, with that, knowing that, was not good advice, was it?
So yeah, I just come back. So basically, yeah, what happened was the officers advised approval and pointed out some significant risks to the council of refusing this application on the grounds that they did, and then the developer took it to appeal. So you're right, the advice was there, the kind of anticipation and foresight was there. However, you know, it is a planning committee and they're allowed to make decisions because they are the accountable body. But they made that decision in the light of that advice, and maybe in the light of the risk that they knew that they would face if the developer went to appeal. Now, I don't know how much that appeal cost, but you are talking hundreds of thousands of pounds very quickly when you go to appeal, with the amount of officer time, legal advice, barristers, King's Counsel, etc., etc. So it can really add up very quickly for a local authority.
I think maybe just to add on the back of what Gareth was talking about, and hopefully the value of this exercise is having this debate, you know, not in a public meeting about an application that we've got as a council before us, because I think it hopefully teases out a lot of the issues. But I think, you know, in relation to this application and those reasons for refusal, it's about thinking sort of what's the next step. So if we as officers are trying to defend a highways reason for refusal, where we've got, you know, in this circumstance we had local highway authority and Highways England not objecting to the application, you know, the question is, what evidence have we got to back that up? And likewise, where we've got a heritage statement, the heritage statement will always be written from the applicant's perspective when they're submitting it. But obviously we had Historic England in this case saying that they didn't object to the application. So what we've always got to be thinking is, what evidence have we got to go against that expert advice? Because obviously we didn't see the full inspector's decision there, but the inspector's starting point will be, what was the advice from the consultee, and then what, if anything, is being presented to indicate there's a problem otherwise. It's not to say that those concerns aren't legitimate. Obviously, when you're looking at 700 houses, the degree of change is significant, and there was that policy conflict. But despite there being a policy conflict, still, what is the harm is the fundamental question. And it's not to say that the consultees are always right, but we would have to go in with some argument as to why we don't think they are right, and that has to be based on some kind of evidence to substantiate it. Otherwise, how is it not going to be unreasonable? And it's having that, and it's absolutely a difficulty. Don't get me wrong. I'm not saying the role of a committee member is by any means easy. Of course it isn't. But and in the pressure of that public meeting, it's thinking, what is the next step? You know, if we refuse it for this reason, yes, you can refuse it today. But what happens? You know, what's the line of argument later down the line? Anyway.
It's just a question really, but we're in this setting where we've got two people effectively speaking against that, but in that setting, how many people spoke against it, and how volatile was that kind of, because there were a lot of objections obviously. How much pressure does that put the committee under? I think that's a question. Here today, there's little pressure, but on that day, or on them two times, the pressure becomes a little bit more, and then that's when sort of common sense sometimes can just lose a little bit of its. Right. You know, you lose a bit of sanity then, because you start thinking about things a little bit too much, and you lose track.
I mean, you're spot on with that. I don't know the details myself, but just having a look through, you know, the fact there was a petition of 1,000 signatures, I mean, that gives you a hint, doesn't it, as to the feelings in the community. I mean, there's a lot of political lessons that come out of this, I think. The first is the message that we have to give, and not when I say we, I mean us as councillors generally, not just because I'm sure, like our authority, you've got some councillors that, well, I'm never going to go on the planning committee. If I'm here for 20 years, I'm never going to set foot in the planning committee. And that's great, but that doesn't mean that your ward is immune from controversial planning applications. So you might well find yourself in the role of coming along to speak, as we saw today. And the first lesson that I tell our new councillors about planning is just to go to your constituents and tell them it's not the X factor. It's not about, we'll approve this because we've got 4,000 people have phoned in to say they're happy with it and only 3,000 have said they're against, or vice versa. It doesn't work like that. And quite frankly, those people signing, if the petition said we're opposed to this scheme, that's a complete and utter waste of everybody's time. The people organising the petition, the people signing the petition, the fact that you don't like an application, well, so bloody what? Quite frankly, if you've got one killer reason that would stop it, whether it's, design, whether it's lack of affordable housing, whether it's car parking issue, whatever, that one killer reason is enough. You might have 10,000 people saying, I don't like it. Well, all very interesting, but so what? We've got to pass it. And the fact that we, as councillors, I mean, it's not your authority, but we as councillors generally don't seem to get that message out is a failure on our part nationally. Was it on that point there? Yeah. Well, I think with costs, that's when you come into what we were talking about in June. Is a decision, you can approve or reject any planning application. The question is your decision reasonable? And it comes back to that sort of corridor, as I always look at it, that outside of the boundaries there is unreasonableness, which you can't stray into. So long as you keep your decision within that boundary, you're fine. And that boundary may, depending on the individual application, that boundary may include approval and may include refusal. Sometimes it won't. But so long as you don't go outside of those boundaries, then I think you're safe with costs. One of the early decisions we took when I was chair of our committee was to refuse something, and we made the classic mistake of chucking reason after reason after reason after reason at it, and we were in the unusual position of winning the appeal but having costs awarded against us. That's amazing. It is, because we put on about 5 or 6 reasons. The inspector agreed solidly with one of those reasons, so said to the applicant, sorry, the council was right, you can't have planning permission, but the council wasted your time by making you defend these other 4 or 5 silly reasons. So you had to spend time and money on silliness, so the council should pay your costs, but because the council had one killer reason, you can't have your planning permission. So you've got to be very, very careful with overturns. Sorry, I interrupted you, David.
I think the only other thing to add really is that I think kind of inherent in the question, having a 5-year housing land supply and then from more recent changes to national policy having a plan that is less than 5 years old is absolutely critical and very much changes the nature of the balance when you're making decisions on applications. So the test is always what is the harm, and the the bar is very much raised if you don't have a 5-year housing land supply and you need to demonstrate one. So, you know, in terms of that lack of the conflict with the local plan will be an easier position to defend if you've got a 5-year housing land supply. Where you haven't, then it's much more nuanced than that. So I think it's always a case of and clearly when we're determining applications here, the officer report will cover, you know, housing land supply and the weight to be given to the policies. And you know, where we have one, where the plan isn't 5 years old, as our position is now as a district council, then you know we're in quite a strong position. But the question will always come back to how do you substantiate the harm? So it's a logical argument to take that if you're extending beyond an allocation, there will be some harm, but there will always be benefits to a proposal. We have to deliver housing against target, and the whole point of being able to demonstrate a 5-year supply is that we're doing that. But where you can't, you know, that balance will shift. So in this case, where they didn't have the required 4-year supply, that would have meant their task at appeal was always going to be much harder.
Can I just ask, it's a bit of an obscure one, but I'd like to ask members from other councils what sort of reaction you get from highways.
We're in a lucky position being a unitary authority, and funny enough, we were just having this conversation on the way here. So our council is the planning authority, but we are also the highways authority. So we're in a very, very lucky position that we don't get, obviously we might get different opinions, but our chief, put it bluntly, our chief executive who manages the planning department also manages the highways department. So their partner, it's what I, as chair, you know, when, not that I manage or give orders out for anything like that, but if I want a response or attendance from highways, it's just like saying I want a planning officer there. It's the same. So I feel for districts who have to deal with highways authorities in counties, which I presume you're in. That's the situation. I think my advice would be that's something for your senior officers to take up. So, if the chair, yeah. So, and I think there's a role for the chair and senior officers to go to the high. I mean, if it's case officer to case officer, and I mean absolutely no disrespect to case officers, but they are at a very junior level. And if you want something from a neighbouring authority, you do have to go up the food chain. And there's no, if your highways authority is playing silly beggars with you, I would have, if I were in your position, I would have no hesitation in going to the director, maybe even the chief executive, to say we're not getting the service as a planning authority we need from Derbyshire, I assume is your county. Take it up at that level. Not for the chair to make that phone call, obviously, but that's what senior officers are there for, to stop log jams.
Just on that, on highways, it's only, I think it's around 2 years ago, it's probably you started, David. We did have the highways department from county come and give the whole, give a briefing of the position that they're in as a highways department on accepting planning applications. And their hands are very much tied, was basically what came from that discussion, which was only around 2 years ago. Whether we need to do that for newer members that have come on and have that brought forward again, that probably would be a good idea.
Yeah, basically they just gave the scenario, didn't they, of you've got 70 houses pulling out onto an A road. If there's more cars using that A road already, we'll pass it, basically. So the only time we're not going to pass anything is if it's some little tiny unadopted road and you want to build 1,000 houses on it.
Yeah, but peak flows
that was
are
as
really
simple
not
as.
taken into consideration, certainly with smaller developments.
But it annoys me that you just get the opinion that they don't even know where the road is. Never mind anything else.
Maybe just coming in quickly on that. I mean, in terms of absolutely, this is basically the start of a training programme, and to be fair, Adrian and I need to kind of work out the next steps on it. So absolutely fine that we can involve highways in that. We can certainly think about how highways are involved in committee meetings, and other consultees for that matter. But just in terms of a point to make in terms of how officers are working, we do have a member of the Highway Authority attend our weekly development management team meetings. So they do have both, obviously, they clearly produce written comments, as members will see, for all committee items, but they do also attend our weekly meetings. So there is a relationship in that respect. The typical line, unfortunately, about resource does apply in terms of wider comments, but certainly, by all means, we can involve them in training sessions, and thinking about how consultees attend committee is definitely something we can take away. But just, I thought I'd offer that reassurance that we do have a working relationship with them that is slightly beyond what members will see at committee.
Thank you. Yeah, I was going to come in on the cost things, because I think we don't get misled that the costs that we get charged for the applicant or whatever, we've still got to incur our costs that don't get. I've been involved with two. When you start involving solicitors and barristers for 2 weeks at a time, and like it says in this press release, that the freedom of information has been made to Ford Council to establish the council's own cost, because that doesn't always come out in things. And every time you try and defend, if you win or lose, you've got to pay them people. And the costs, as we call them, are few and far between when you have to pay the opposition's costs as well as. Usually they have to stand that, but we always have to stand down, don't we? It's very rare a council can claim their costs back. So it's something to consider when it's not a cheap option.
Something else that struck me was coming from the objection speaker at the end, saying, you do know there's an election on, don't you, councillors? Which we've all heard. We could do this exercise in any council up and down the country, and we've all heard it. It just amazes me why any applicant would want to. Do you have annual elections here, or are you 4 yearly? 4 yearly. So a little bit different from us. We're annual, but it just strikes me, why would any applicant who knows anything about this bring an application to be decided in March or April, just before an election? That's when we're all going to be jumpy, we're all going to be nervous. Any councillor in this room who says they're not nervous in March or April of an election year is a liar, and I would include me in that as well. We all have that looking over our shoulder. So I always say to our development management officers, if there's something that's controversial, we can't tell applicants when to apply. That's entirely their choice, but we can give them very strong advice. Bring something in May or June, just after the election, when we're all relaxed, we've all won our seats, we're all over the nervousness. And it's that lack of understanding. Again, it's not just the public who misunderstand things, it can be applicants too.
Any more reflections? I suppose one thing that I was, really pleased to see, and quite pleased that none of the questions were about non-material issues, all very focused on those issues that are in the report that the case officer emphasised, but trying to dig down and really understand the kind of reasoning behind the officer's recommendations. And I think that's really to be kind of promoted and kind of encouraged, because let's be honest, we were having this question, weren't we, coming down? Officers can be very black and white about this and say, it's a straightforward decision, it's obvious, isn't it, really? But that just really masks over such a range of issues that you will be able to come to. So that idea of just questioning some of the assumptions and getting office to explain the thinking, I think that's really helpful. Like the question we had on section 106 and contributions, You know, I did have to go back to the report and double check what I would have, or Nina would have written as the case officer, because there's such a range of issues to consider. We don't always, you know, we don't always have to hand the immediate answer. But I hope you found that most of the answers were in the officer's report. They just might need elaborating on. And I think, you know, the question that you asked, didn't you, can you just explain this paragraph a little bit better, is a perfectly reasonable question. So we get away from, you know, just relying on planning jargon and acronyms. I'm sure your reports are kind of fully comprehensive, aren't they, Adrian, when your stuff
Well, I would make an observation that it brings into question the relevance of outline planning. I've retired now, but I spent a lot of time ignoring outline planning. Because really what everybody wants to know is what's going to be built. And the outline planning for that's what point I was trying to make, for such a major scheme, it means nothing to me because it's not enforceable. So really, we might want to think about, is it really relevant? Because the local plan, all it was doing was moving the red line for the local plan for site designated for housing, really. But with all the other matters to be dealt with, I know there was the highway issue, but when I think back to the master plans around here that for various things that have occurred over the years, and then look from the Google Earth at what's actually been constructed, it bears little resemblance because so many factors change.
For me, I think the outline application is a really important step. And actually, I don't know what you feel, but from a planning committee's perspective, getting to discuss things in principle, getting to discuss things at outline, getting to discuss things the general kind of remit of what's going to happen, puts you in a better position so you don't get bogged down in detail straight away, and then you still get a second bite of the cherry to consider the decisions.
Yeah, the number of reserved matters applications that I've seen that committees have to deal with, and people start saying, well, I don't think we can take 600 dwellings here, but that might be a relevant consideration, but it was a relevant consideration 3 months ago. And if you don't think that housing of this size or density should be built here, that's a perfectly valid viewpoint, but today is the chance to say that. What you are saying today is that this site can take 600 dwellings. And once the decision is taken, they can't go back on that. Next time we can discuss the design, what they look like, the layout should be maybe on that side of the street, that side of the street. And that's all very interesting and relevant, but today is the big one in terms of, are we going to have this level of housing here or not? And too many people give up the chance to say it at this stage. You do it at your peril.
That's the other button, thank you. I think the question maybe goes to the heart of some of the genuine trade-offs we have as a planning authority, not just when dealing with planning applications, but also when we're looking at the local plan stage. So obviously members will be familiar with the current local plan and the fact that we've got two significant allocations, former Bywaters and then the Avenue site. And one of the advantages of those large sites is that you've got, in those cases, two sites delivering a large proportion of your housing need. So in many respects that's great, because instead of that you haven't got the alternative, which is a lot of smaller sites that might be seen as disrupting more communities. However, you've then got the challenge of how long it takes for those sites to come forward. So obviously in our case, when the current local plan was adopted, quite a few of them were quite a way on, and they still will take a long time to come forward. If those sites are allocated at the point where they're still very much in their infancy, i.e. basically we've got sufficient information to say it's deliverable, but there aren't any spades in the ground, there isn't a planning permission in place, the likelihood is that the outline, it will be an outline that comes forward, because the landowner will obviously want to secure the uplift that is secured by that planning permission, because the allocation will achieve some of that, but a planning permission provides the certainty, because under the current system the local plan will say an approximate number, approximate this, approximate that. So the land value is increased by an outline, and then of course they can sell the parcels off. And we can't prevent that from happening. So I think it's just an interesting point in that there isn't an ideal solution to either, because on paper, I think many would say, well, you just go for a few large sites so that you upset as few people as possible. But the reality around deliverability is it's quite a different challenge then. And of course, if they lag behind, you might have 5-year housing land supply issues, and then you're looking at those smaller sites as speculative ones anyway. So these are the challenges that we have to grapple with.
And I think, just to build on that, the policy writing or policy reviewing stage is something that councillors always overlook and forget, or don't, and I don't mean planning committee members, but councillors as a whole. Some of the arguments we heard from the public speakers, you know, we've always enjoyed this green area, we use it for bird watching and picking apples and all the rest of it. That's great, and that might well be true, but the time to say that was when you were writing your local plan. If you think this should be green space forevermore and never have a house built on it, that's a perfectly valid view to take, but that's something to feed into the plan. Once the plan says this site's for housing, and that's been agreed and it's all signed off, that argument's gone. So don't wait for, if there's something in, you know, I'll say this to any councillor, something in your ward or your city or your district that you want to protect in terms of green space, don't wait for a planning application, because it will be far too late. Get in at the local plan, have it, it might be unsuitable, I don't know, every case is different, but get in at that point and argue for it remaining green space. And if you're successful, it makes it so much easier to bat off planning applications when they come in.
This is a strange one, but talking of non-material, you know, etc. As a committee, we are humans. We had an application recently. It was a traveller site application, and he threw in the cancer card. Wife needs to be here for cancer treatment. I mean, I know, you know, we aren't supposed to take any notice of things like that, but people do. And also it puts officers in a difficult situation, because if they turn around and say, I'm sorry, you can't, that isn't a consideration, it makes them look awful. So I just thought, you know, it's things that happen to committees.
Yeah, I mean, part of the issue, as I'm sure we all know, is that public pressure and taking, you know, I mean, what's not to like about keeping green spaces for bird watching? Who thinks bird watching in nice fields is a bad thing? I certainly don't. But we're constrained in the decisions that we have to make. And although there are some instances where individual circumstances can be taken into account, you mentioned the medical treatment. I mean, we had one a few years ago where somebody wanted to build a house extension on a normal sort of 1930 semi-detached, all fairly uniform. And it was a huge, you know, looked like something out of Star Wars, what they wanted to put on the back of it. But they had, I forget the details, they had a child who had severe disability, so they needed the access and medical equipment and all the rest of it. So the recommendation from the officers was to approve, and our officers were upfront with the fact that if this was someone who wanted exactly the same physical development for a snooker room, they'd have recommended refusal, or wanted it for a shed to keep their tools in, they'd have refused it. But because of those individual circumstances, the recommendation was to approve. But it's extremely rare that they'll say, or a planning authority should say, you can have this because of your personal circumstances. And that's something, again, it's like the bird watching, it's like the petition, explaining that to the public, that we're not here to listen to everybody's own, I don't want to say sob story, because that's insulting, but everyone's own individual circumstance. We're not here to do that. We're here to say, is what's proposed in the public good, given your local plan, given the NPPF and so forth. And that's quite hard for the public to appreciate a lot of the time.
I think you've started to pull out these issues, these learning points that I guess we try and design this case study to emphasise and draw on. So, yeah, listening to officer advice on defendable decisions. So I actually, like the real life local authority didn't do, you know, listening to officer's advice on what is a defendable decision, even if you go ahead and lose an appeal, is still important because of the risk of costs, and it's advice that therefore should be considered. Working with officers to reach a sound decision, you know, I think we covered this in the first session, and you'll know you got really good officers. They're paid to be professionals. You're not expected to know all the policies in detail, but the officers do. That was the reason you saw Nina put up one slide with a whole range of different local plan policies on and highlight a few. There's a whole range of policies that your officers will look at. You can't possibly know all of them, but you need to be confident that your officers have done the job for you and they explain which are the most important. And I think this is one of the points as well. And you hear it sometimes with objectors. They can quote one policy in the local plan as a reason to object to an application. But as we know, we've got to compare an application against all relevant policies in a local plan, and that can be a significant task as well. So as we say, base your decisions on clear evidence, not hunch. The mistake of, I keep mentioning him now, Swale Borough Council, not that they're always going to make mistakes like, but the mistake of the kind of real life committee was that they refused on grounds that were not backed up by evidence, things like highways, things like the setting of the listed building. It was their view, but the professional report and the evidence that was available and that the planning inspector used to come to a decision didn't support their hunch. And also, I think we've already covered this, and as Bill said, you don't feel you have to maximise the number of reasons for refusal. You know, four is often quite a lot. One good one is better than 12 weak ones. And that example of being costs awarded against you even where you win the appeal, you know, is an extreme example of why that's so important as well. And I think, sorry, someone asked about the number of speakers that can speak against an application like this. You had a question about how many speakers spoke against the application in the real life case study. I think the officer report said there were about 248 objections to this, which is correct. But as you read later on in the newspaper article, there was also a whole list of 1,000 signatures on a petition against this application. And as we've already heard, it's not the volume, it's not the number, it's the quality and the relevance of objections that make the difference. So don't be swayed by volumes. And I know, speaking to you guys in the break as well, you have a constitution where more than one person can speak against, more than one objector can speak against an application. I do work with other authorities where their constitution limits the amount of people who can speak for or against and requires objectors to find one spokesperson to air all of their concerns, so that it's not a numbers game, if you like. It's about the quality. And then finally, of course, implement your own council's policies. The local plan is our reference point. As we heard right at the outset, the current government are looking to make sure every local authority has local plan coverage and up-to-date local plan coverage. At the moment, I think only about 1/3 of local authorities have an up-to-date local plan. So you can see something's going wrong in the system. You have got an up-to-date local plan. I'm sure officers will be considering what needs to be done to refresh that as it comes towards the end of its 5 years. But start by looking at how you're implementing your own council's policies. So do stay in touch. I think it's really promising to hear what you say as well, David, about this being ongoing training as well. And there are resources and things available on our website. If we can help in any way we can, obviously. That's not just to charge for service, that's just by sharing any information that we can on our website. I'm not trying to sell the PAS service. We are here to try and make sure that we support local authorities in any way we can. One final way you can just help us again, like last time, if you could complete the feedback form today, we'd be really grateful. Thank you, Alan, so that we get some feedback, and if you think we can improve in any areas, then do let us know. But really appreciate your time. Thank you very much. Oh, one last.
Yeah, thanks everybody. I'd just like to thank Gareth, Nina and Councillor Stevens, also Adrian, Fiona and Julian. The Oscars will be on the way, I'm sure. And thank you all for your time. Hope that's been a constructive session. Obviously it's linked to the first session as well. And as I say, we are looking to roll out a training programme. Obviously there's a million things we could cover in planning. I think we wanted to start with the fundamentals, if you like, that we can then build on, and perhaps have some more kind of topic-focused discussions. Highways and transport, happy to be one of those. So there'll be more communication about that as we go forward. But thank you very much for your time, and I hope you found it useful. Thank you.